One of the most important features of Active Directory are the 5 single operations masters, otherwise known as FSMO roles, flexible single operations masters. There are actually 5 different roles. We have the schema master, and the schema master, as you can appreciate, basically maintains the schema. And as we've discussed earlier, the schema is essentially a mapping of all the different object types in Active Directory, so users, computers, groups, and so on. We also have something called the domain naming master, and the domain naming master makes it possible to, for example, add domains. So, for example, if you want to install a new child domain or reference a domain in another part of your organization, you will need a domain naming master. You've also got something called the RID master, or the relative identifier, and this is one of the most important roles because essentially it's responsible for dishing out SIDs. Now, what is a SID, I hear you say? Well, a SID means security identifier. Now, in the normal world, you and me, we reference objects in Active Directory by names. So, for example, my name is Andy, I'm in an OU called sales, and so on. That's all very simple and easy. But Active Directory doesn't represent objects like that. Active Directory uses something called security principles. So, for example, a security group and a user are examples of principles. And each of these principles or objects is represented by a security identifier, which is a huge long number, which is absolutely unique in the domain. So the RID, or relative identifier, is responsible for dishing out these SIDs, and it kind of dishes them out in blocks. Another role is something called the PDC emulator, and the PDC emulator really kind of, as you can imagine, the PDC, primary domain controller, basically gives support for Windows NT4 domains, and also it provides support for time services in Active Directory. The final role is the infrastructure master role, and this is quite an important role because, as you can appreciate, you've got lots and lots of information in Active Directory. If you can imagine, if you go to your C drive on your computer and you click on the C drive, and on the left-hand side you see a complete representation of all the container objects of your file system. Well, in essence, the infrastructure role does the same thing. It provides a mapping of all the container objects in Active Directory. Now, these 5 roles function at different levels of your forest. So, for example, the schema and the domain naming master function at the forest level of your organization. And the other 3 roles, well, these function at the domain level. So in each domain, each child domain in your organization, these 3 roles will function. If you have a single domain environment with only one domain controller, then it's obvious that all 5 roles would be actually on the one server. As you introduce other domain controllers to your environment, it might be a good idea to separate these 5 roles amongst your domain controllers. On the other hand, if you have a multiple domain environment, then we have a tree structure here. And of course, the first domain controller that you install, well, this is going to maintain the forest infrastructure. So those 2 roles, of course, are the schema master and the domain naming master. So at each domain level, you're also going to have those other 3 roles, of course, which they are the RID master, the PDC emulator, and the infrastructure master. So it's important as you plan your domain structure to think about how you're going to distribute these 5 roles. So there you have it, the flexible single master operations roles in Active Directory Services 2008.